Hello, I'm Dave. Um, in, let's see, it was the fall and winter of 1990. Um, I went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst and completed a seasonal National Park Service law enforcement academy. Prior to that, I had graduated college with a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice in Fairmont State College, West Virginia. And then I had gotten a job with Connecticut's Department of Environmental Protection as a park patrolman, and I had completed 2 blocks of the Connecticut's Police Academy for their park officers. But then I decided to go with the Seasonal National Park Service because I wanted to get into the federal system. So I completed that, passed it, and I had also been interested in being a game warden. My internship in West Virginia was with the Department of Natural Resources, so I worked with conservation officers. And in the state of Connecticut, I'd been a park patrolman and a deer checker. So I was like, this is the kind of work I'm really interested in doing. So when I completed the seasonal training in Amherst, I took a job called a Refuge officer. I'd never heard of them before. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Interior, and they were law enforcement that protected national wildlife refuges. So I put in for one in Rhode Island and Connecticut. At the time, my family was living in Madison, Connecticut. So I thought I'd be close to home. So, go inside, Buck. So I took a job, accepted a job at Ninigret National Wildlife Refuge, again on the coast of Rhode Island, and part of it's down in Connecticut too. And this was 1991 in March, and the old uniform back then, you wore the pumpkin pants, which were gold, and with the tan shirt. Had brown basket weave. I carried the Model 66 .357 Magnum revolver. It was probably, those years were they were the end of the 6-shooters. So you would have your .357, then I had 2 speed loaders in the front, and then I carried something called speed strips with 6 rounds in this little rubber thing that was flexible that you could peel off one at a time into the cylinder of the revolver. And the speed loaders, I mean, most people don't know about them anymore. So you shoot your 6 rounds, you trim your gun upside down, you eject the rounds out of the cylinder. Speed loader was a cartridge that had the 6 rounds. You'd stick it in the thing, click it, close your wheel, and then you were ready to go again. So there were a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at one time seasonal officers that summer. One quit early. I was the first one on and the first one to leave. I did 9 months there at Ninigret. Basically, I was given my badge and my gun belt and gun, and told, here's the keys to the Blazer. It was an old Chevy Blazer, a tank, one of the big ones with 350 V8 in it, blue with the white like fiberglass thing in the back, Kojak light on it, no light bars. It had the Fish and Wildlife emblem stickers on the side, said for government use only. And it was a little beat up, but it drove pretty good. The radio was only for Refuge only. So back then, the refuges, they had their radios could speak to people working in the refuge, but they also you could skip and hear other refuges across the country. So it had big old ball antenna with coils, and it was like a big whip. And I forgot what kind of radio that was, but it was old school. But it was, and if you don't touch that antenna when you're keying the mic, or you'll get a burn. I mean, it'll burn your hand. So that was my job. First day, here's your gun, here's your badge, go. I was like, okay. Pulled out a map. Oh, here's the refuges. So in Ninigret, they're scattered. They're small refuges. They're beautiful. They were, back then, it was a beautiful area, scattered up and down the coast. And there were certain ones that were priorities. And one was Trustham Pond. So there was about a 1.5-mile stretch of beach and maybe a 300 or 400 acre refuge. The beach had piping plovers and least terns, ESA species. So we would put giant holes in the ground using a backhoe with rope with signs that said no trespassing. And anyone that went under the rope into the nesting zone, which was above the mean high tide, would get a ticket, a $100 fine for trespass. I was excited because I really wanted to be a game warden. Here I am, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Refuge law enforcement. I'm going to be a federal game warden. Did very little fish and game work. And that's, it's probably the same way now, is especially the more East Coast or urban refuges, you're more like an urban park ranger. You're dealing not with poachers and wildlife smugglers as much as you are people doing stupid things, recreational types. So we wrote a lot of tickets to people trespassing on the beach. It was a nude beach, and so, below the mean high tide, people could walk below the rope during low tide, and they'd be naked. The interior of the refuge had a nice saltwater pond, was really cool, and they had some meadows and fields. Major pickup spot for gay men. Now, the early 90s, people didn't come out. And so this is the kind of place they would go to hook up and meet and do their thing. And that turned out to be a major problem on the refuge. A lot of tickets for men engaging in sexual activity. And I remember saying, like, I want to be a game warden. I don't want to deal with guys banging each other in the woods. But that was a problem. And it was, I'm not bashing people that are gay, but at that time, at that location, that was a significant issue. They had their own little culture. They would back their cars in. They had stickers they would place up on their visor, signals to meet with one another. They had little trails. And, so when I was in the interior of the refuge hiking the trails, I would take a fishing line and all these illegal trails that went into the closed areas. I would just put thread or fishing line so I could see if someone tripped it. And if I saw a car backed in, I said, something's going on. I'd walk back there and almost always found people engaged in, activities. So I would write them up for, I think it was like disorderly conduct. But I learned you can use those skills for fish and game violations. Learning how to track people, how to see if people are using trails or not. But still, it wasn't something that I was just like, I got to do this. But you had to, because sometimes it was not very far off a main trail. You had school groups coming all the time, and these guys are doing things not far from school groups. And it didn't matter if it was, on a rare occasion, I catch, a man and a woman doing it. And I wrote them up too. That wasn't the place to do it. We did a lot of resource management work, which that part I really liked. Putting the nesting enclosures around the plovers where they were, they piping plovers lay their eggs right on the sand. So we'd see them once they laid the eggs. We'd come in and put a fencing enclosure with wire on top so that ravens and gulls, raccoons couldn't get to the nesting site. Because there's not many places left on the New England coast that are where beaches aren't developed, and there's not a lot of beach use. Other refuges there and they've increased the land since I've been there. There was Satchwis Point, which was in Newport, and that was neat. It was a couple 200 acres maybe. Again, my numbers. It's been a long time since '91. It's 2020 now. But Satchew's Point was an old military base. It's a peninsula near Newport, Rhode Island. Beautiful rocky coastline. Up top, it's like this brushy, with trails going through the brush, but beautiful views of this, rugged coastline. Seals, harlequin ducks, which are a really beautiful duck. I used to do some fishing enforcement there. Tautog, blackfish, was one of the main species fishermen would catch. And one of the things they would do is they would have a bucket, and let's say the total fish you could have was, 6 fish. What they would do is usually they would catch 3 and put in the bucket, legal limits, but the rest you'd have to sit on them and watch them. And there was these tidal pools up in the rocks, and so they would put the fish in the tidal pools. And so if a warden came down and checked them, it'd be like, oh, okay, you got the legal limit, and they'd go. And then when they were done for the evening, they'd go to their tidal pool and just pack the bucket up with over the limit. And so you'd sit there, and I would sit there and watch them. And maybe 3 or 4 tickets doing that. They were hard tickets because you would have to spend maybe 1 to 2 hours, maybe even more, sitting in the brush with binoculars. Okay, this guy caught 1 fish, puts it in the bucket. At this time, I had a little notebook. This guy caught another fish. And I like doing this. I like watching them. And then they'd be doing this, and they'd walk over and stick it. And I'd be like, yes, he's poaching. I've got a case. And once you know you've got something, it's like, yeah, it's a good feeling. And so, that'd be a good, I think it was a $150 fine for over limits or so. Part of the problem with Satchew's Point, here's an example I'll never forget. I'm, again, watching this guy. I saw him put 2 in the tidal pool. So I know he's going to poach. He's going to take over his limit. He's put 3 in there, and I'm up in the rocks looking down on him. And then there's a little sandy spit next to him, and there's 2 kids playing. And I'm like, okay. And just for some reason, I looked over my shoulder, and there's a guy, naked. He's got tennis shoes on. He's watching the kids, and he's whacking off. He's masturbating. And this is, again, part of the problem being a refuge officer in kind of a urban-type park. What's your priority? Okay, your badge says Fish and Wildlife. I got a good poaching case I'm ready to make. No, your priority is always going to be, public safety. Same thing with whether you're Park Service or BLM. You're not like game wardens that can, if they want to, they can just say focus on this and say that's not my job. You really can't do that. And I would feel guilty anyway because that's a priority. What this guy was doing was wrong. So I came out of the brush, put my binocular in the backpack, and then he sees me coming and the race is on. He's running down the trails naked with tennis shoes, and I'm chasing after him, yelling, "Federal game warden, freeze, put your hands up," and he's not listening. And I finally called up to him and just, what are you going to grab? He doesn't have anything on, grab around the chest and say, knock it off. Don't run. Where is your clothes? He goes, I'm not doing anything, I'm not doing anything. Here's the deal, I'm going to arrest you. You're going to be naked, and I'm going to haul you to jail this way. Where's your ID? Where's your clothes? So he's like, oh, I don't know where my clothes are. I said, okay, where's your car? Finally got him to admit where the car was. I said, okay, we're going this way. And I took him to a busy parking lot, people, and he's totally naked in his tennis shoes. I get him to open up. His keys are under the wheel, and get his ID. And while I'm writing down, so back then, we couldn't write tickets. So there were CBV tickets that we would eventually type up, but we had something called a pink slip. And so you would write up the pink slip and give it to a refuge manager, or it would be sent to a special agent, and they would decide whether it was a good ticket or not. But I remember on that case, I wrote him up, and I lectured him loudly. Masturbating to children, you're a sick jerk. That's not tolerated here. We're not going to tolerate that. Do you understand that? You could tell this guy's like a crowd of people's watching him. I said, what you did is you're a pervert. Disorderly conduct. That's all we had. sometimes especially at Satchwell's Point, a lot of dog walkers, those were the most confrontational cases, dogs off leash. Um, they'd scream, cuss at you. I mean, and when you're starting out new, and you haven't been through like what I would call a real academy yet, the first time you say, okay, you're a violation of the law. Can I see your driver's license? And someone says, F you, asshole. They're screaming in your face. I'll be honest, I was nervous a couple times dealing with dog violations. They were scary. These people were like ready to fight. Like, their dog has a right to be off leash. And, but that's good practice, having people just in your face screaming at you. You got to either get used to it or get out of it. And it was good for me to like, okay. The first couple times you're like, oh my God, your heart's pounding and you're like, but after a while you just take it and you're like, okay. I can see you're having a bad day. Yeah, guess what? You're going to get a ticket for this. Put your dog on a leash. Once you get used to it, that initial screaming in your face, it doesn't bother you quite as much. So, dogs off leash, perverts at Satchwell's Point. Occasional, you get a good fishing case. Trustin Pond, it was a gay hookup place, and you had beach users, busy day, going under the ropes. When the tide came in, so they'd walk down to the end of the beach, but when they came back and the tide's coming in, they couldn't walk below the ropes anymore because the tide was up. So then they have to dip under the ropes, and you ride them up. Now back then, one of the problems was the U.S. magistrate in Providence. He basically came out and said during court once, before I got there, I will not accept any U.S. Fish and Wildlife cases in my court. So they had stopped for a while. Nobody was winning any cases. He would just say dismissed. And he finally said, don't come here anymore. So I had one that guy didn't pay. It was a trespass case under the ropes at Trustin Pond. So I went there. So here's Judge Hygopia. Never forget that name. Providence, Rhode Island, U.S. Magistrate. And what Hygopia said to me was, I told your agency don't bring cases to my court anymore. You've been told. And I said, sir, may I speak? He goes, yes. And I said, you have the authority to dismiss my cases. You can dismiss them, but you don't have the authority to stop me from doing my job. I'm going to continue writing tickets. I will continue to show up here in the courtroom. And if you dismiss them, then that's beyond my control. But Congress is who I work for. I'm an executive department. Congress writes the rules and regulations I enforce. Just like you work for somebody. I have to continue to come here. So he heard the case. And the guy was kind of a jerk. He said, well, I didn't feel like, walking under the ropes. I saw the sign. And the officer had warned me an hour before not to go under the ropes, but I did it anyway. I don't care. Well, guess what? I won one of the first trespass cases at Trustin Pond. Was that kind of ballsy to say that to a magistrate? But I was polite about it. I said, you know what? You can't stop me from coming to court. You can dismiss everything I bring, but I'm going to keep showing up. There was another refuge there, Ninigret, and it was just runways. It had been a military base. George Bush learned to fly there. Another thing, too, I want to mention is that during this whole time as a seasonal, we didn't have bulletproof vests. I asked for a new one, and they said no, they're not going to buy them. We had radios that only reach the refuge headquarters. We had no batons. We just had our 357, 2 speed loaders. We had no bulletproof vest. Finally, one of the biologists said it was a collateral duty officer, gave me an old vest. It didn't have a plate on it. It was just the soft armor, but it was something. So that's what I wore. But there was Ninigret National Wildlife Refuge, and that was the former air base. It had runways, and I heard they've torn them up. Usually slow. It also had a little spit way out on the beach. You had to drive for miles in four-wheel drive over sand dunes to get to it. Nobody who ever went out there was so far out. It took you all day to get there. But the main part was the runways, and they were still there. And they were big X's were painted on them in yellow so planes wouldn't land on them. I had a few things that were interesting to happen there. I had, there were trails. You could drive down the trails, and then you could drive on the runways. And like I said, there was 3 major runways, and they were all crisscrossed, and a lot of seashells on them. Gulls would drop the shells. But I could hear a plane revving up. I said, that's weird. These runways are closed. So I drove real fast to get to which runway, and I didn't know which one it was, but I finally turned onto the one, and I could see like a twin-engine Beechcraft Baron turning towards me, and a speedboat taking off because the runway ended next to Ninigret Bay. Big speedboat taking off, and the plane's running down the runway towards me. It was a long runway. He got up and over, and I didn't get a chance to get the tail number. But I remember telling the boss, I said, this is what happened. You got planes landing there. And I was kind of ignorant. He was like, well, you're probably lucky you got there late, or you wouldn't be here right now. He goes, it was probably a drug deal going on. But, it's, you learn things. It's like, oh, it's like Miami Vice stuff. That's for real? Yeah, it happens, even in Rhode Island. I also would find sometimes big bags, burlap bags of oysters. People had picked, and then they would hide on the banks of the refuge. So I just pick them up. I tried to do surveillance. I never caught anyone. We had at that time a terrible working relationship with Rhode Island's DEM, I think it was Department of Environmental Management. Their lead conservation officer, Tom Green maybe, hated U.S. Fish and Wildlife and basically said, no, we're not going to work with you. Matter of fact, we don't want you doing fish and game in our state. You don't have authority. Hopefully things have changed. The guy was a jerk, and I got in some arguments with him when he showed up on the refuge. He said, you're not going to tell me what to do. Then there was the Block Island Refuge. Block Island National Wildlife Refuge. We went out there like twice. Beautiful. You'd have to spend a whole day out there because you take the ferry boat. But it was this tiny little, 20-acre thing with a lighthouse. But it was cool. Beautiful. Block Island's gorgeous, And anytime you had a chance to go out there to put no trespassing by the lighthouse signs or something, or refuge signs, blue goose signs, it was all a treat. Go have lunch in the town, and go out there and work on the refuge. Next was Salt Meadow down in Connecticut. There was a different manager for that refuge. We weren't allowed to carry guns on the Salt Meadow National Wildlife Refuge, and we only did maintenance work there. I'd ride a tractor. I knew how to drive a tractor, and I would mow the fields. And he was like, I mean it. You're not going to carry a gun. I don't want you writing tickets. Just give warnings. This is a new refuge, and we don't want to upset people. I also had my gun and gear in my backpack, but I was just like, that's BS. You can't tell me not to wear a gun. But back then, they could say that. And, you're seasonal, wanting to be full-time. You're not going to rock the boat. And then Shimmin Island and Sheffield Island. And then there was another one. I'm trying to think. I can't think of it. Off Madison. An island. There used to be a zillion rabbits out there. Big, beautiful lighthouse. I even have a little statue of the lighthouse that I bought because I'd worked out there. But Shimmin Island, we would live there. There was a cabin. And we painted it. And I used to go out there a lot on weekends. They all sent me down. It was a Boston whaler. Again, we had no boating training, me and the other refuge officers. But I'd been around boats growing up. And I remember I would have a little notebook. And I knew it got foggy there in Long Island Sound. So I would say, okay, if I go 3 miles an hour, 4 miles an hour for 10 minutes, due north, and then out of Norwalk, and then I take a east turn or due east and do another 4 miles an hour and go another 15 minutes or so, that'll get me to the boat launch. And so I wrote that down so that when it was foggy, at least I knew, okay, if I just retrace this in the fog, which is kind of scary because you don't know, you can't see anything. But if you do it and beep your horn a lot, you'll get to where you need to go. I didn't know at the time, but it's called dead reckoning, and it works. Shimmon Island, it was cool. It was like 40 acres, and Sheffield was next door. Um, so we had this cabin. The island's filled with rats. I mean, millions and millions of rats. So you'd sleep on your cot in a mummy sleeping bag, even if it was warm and hot, and you'd zip it all the way over your head because you could feel them crawling on you sometimes. And you'd be like, oh God, there's rats. We'd eat dinner. I used to bring a BB gun with me, and we'd eat dinner and throw little hot dog pieces from the fire at the edge where the firelight was, you couldn't quite see into the woods, and you'd see all these rats hitting it with the little BB gun, Red Ryder, but there were just tons of rats. We did gull counts on the north end of the island. You had to put on overalls, a hard hat, and goggles. And there was just tons of hearing gulls. They crap on you and peck you on the head and attack you, but we would count how many gull nests there were. There was also black-crowned night herons inland. So you weren't allowed to go into the island or to the north end where the nesting sites were, but on the south end of, I guess south or west end of the island, there was a little beach, so people would pull up and sunbathe, and that was okay. We just made sure at night they didn't party. And then we'd take the boat over to Sheffield. I think they're called the Thimble Islands, maybe, off Norwalk. We didn't write many tickets there, gave a lot of warnings sometimes for people drinking beer and telling them to clean your trash up. But it was kind of neat to live out on the island, even dealing with the rats. It was there were deer out there. I don't know how they got there because that part of Connecticut is really urbanized on the coast. And these little islands, 40 acres, but there's white-tailed deer out there running around. The first time you see one, like, how did that get here? But they swim. They swim across. I look back on it now, and come on outside. My cat's going in and out. But you look at where refuge officers are now and where it was then. And at that time, I think there was maybe less than 12 full-time refuge law enforcement officers. And then there were seasonal scattered like at Parker River, Ninigret, Chincoteague, Lockahachie, and they eventually got one at Ding Darling, I think. I think that was it. They didn't have a few seasonals for the coastal summertime. And then for the full-time, I eventually became full-time at DeSoto Bend on the Iowa-Nebraska border. But back then, it was like 250 collateral duty officers, tractor operators, maintenance workers, biologists, outdoor recreation planners. But there was only, like I said, maybe 12 full-time refuge law enforcement officers. And we were 1802 GS 567s. So on the East Coast, there was Parker River and for full-time. And then there was Chincoteague, maybe Merritt Island, Florida Panther, Chazzowitzka maybe. On the West Coast, one in San Francisco. There was one in DeSoto, one at Minnesota Valley, which was a new refuge at the time. Yazoo in Mississippi, I think, had one. And then one or two, like in Louisiana, that were 1802s. So there just weren't many full-time law enforcement. You were either a collateral duty biologist, fire management officer, outdoor rec planner, like I said, tractor operator, heavy equipment operator. But that was my start of my 25-year career in the federal system as a seasonal refuge officer. And, good and bad memories. I did have one, what I consider actually two close calls. I'm at 29 minutes, so I'll discuss them real quickly. Is once the other seasonals left, I stayed on all the way till December. And I started working nights. No one had ever worked nights on the Ninigret Refuge. I was at Trustham Pond, and as I'm pulling there, I see a car pull in. So I said, this is interesting. It's like 10 o'clock at night. I pull in behind it. I'm trying to use good officer tactics. Behind it and coming up and the lights flashing. We didn't call it. We had no dispatcher radio systems then. Um, so the kids are in the car. They're two kids. Hey, what are you doing? The refuge is closed now. You're gonna have to leave. And soon I see another car pulling up, and it blocks the entrance out. And a guy's getting out. And I'm like, hey, you need to get back in your car. I'll deal with you in a second. All of a sudden, the kids are getting out. So the kids are coming up towards me, and the guy's coming up behind me. And now I'm like, oh, I'm screwed. I have no backup. It's pretty remote there. It was at the time. There were no houses nearby. It's dark. I have my mag light. And I'm telling the guy, and he's not listening. And I'm like, so I put my hand on the gun, unstrap it. It was a breakaway holster. And I'm telling him, don't come any closer. Don't come any closer. He's walking towards me. He's telling the kids. He's doing like signals to them. And I'm like, I mean it. I'm going to draw my gun and I'll shoot. You're making me nervous. I feel my life's in danger. And I'm starting to push it out of the holster. So it's front breakaway and it's already almost completely out. And now I'm starting to yell at him. I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to kill you. Get out of here now. And he's like, kids, go. And he runs back to his car. They get theirs and they're starting theirs up. They get inside and I had a pen. I put the gun back in and I write down his number. And I already had theirs. And, I got in the Blazer. It's a bigger vehicle. Reversed it. And I was like, at least I can ram him if I had to. But he lifts, and pulls out, and they go. So the next day I tell the refuge manager what happened. And we talked to the local police. That plate did come back to somebody of interest. And apparently it was believed that this man was trading sexual favors from young boys for drugs and alcohol. And I walked into it. And I was lucky. I don't know if he had guns or weapons. But when you're up against three people, that really was the first time ever where I was like scared and knowing that I felt like if I had to pull my gun, if they had charged me, it would have been justified. 3 against 1. And we didn't have impact weapons. We didn't have an Aspeton then. I had actually had gone down one day. I got permission to drive down to later after that to go to Floyd Bennett Field, train with Park Police on the PR-24, like a brief introductory training, so I could have intermediate weapon. The other thing was 2 older guys hunting in a field that was wrong, a Trustin Pond, dove hunting. I was in the legal field. They're in the illegal field. There's a stone wall and a little hedgerow and some trees. So I'm like, I got to climb over the fence to get to them. They took a sound shot. And first thing I did was, I was like, I'm going to get my face blown off. Fortunately, the guy shot up high next to a tree, and it rained pellets down on me. And I'm screaming, federal game warden, drop your gun, drop your gun. And these older guys, they were like almost in tears, dropping their guns. And, it was like, what were you shooting at? Why were you shooting at me? We heard a sound. We thought it was a dove. And I'm like, if you don't know what it is, you don't shoot. I didn't write them a ticket. I guess I could have. They were probably in their 60s, but it was like, don't ever do that. You could have killed me. And, that was kind of a wake-up call. This is a dangerous job. Again, I was a seasonal with very limited training, and I was learning this stuff on my own. We didn't have FTOs. It was literally, here's your gun and badge. Go do it. You've been to seasonal training. You should know what to do. And I had this book on refuge rules and regulations. That's how I learned. And it's not a good way to learn. A few other quick things, that I got to do that was cool. They allowed me to go. I was interested in wanting to become an agent, so they allowed me to go up to Boston, Logan International. I worked with a wildlife inspector for a day, doing inspections and stuff like that. That was really cool, and I learned a lot, about smuggling and things like that. Some of the wildlife management, addling mute swan eggs. Boy, mute swans are hardcore. You don't want to tick them off. They're exotics. So instead of smashing the eggs, you shake it, put it back, they'll sit on it, and it won't nest. So that's what mute swan addling is. Man, they're nasty birds. And I also worked an interesting case that was maybe a little outside the scope of what I should have been doing, but legally I was okay. I'm at 35 minutes. I'll go real quick on this one. Coming back from Ninigret, and I see in someone's home, I'm driving down the road, they got 2 turkey vultures in their front yard that are tied to, like, they're on perches. And I'm like, what the heck is that? Turn around, pull in their driveway, knock on the door. I say, hey, I'm Dave Riley, Fish and Wildlife. Can I see your permit? I wasn't really sure in migratory bird treaty you have permits, but I figured you needed a permit, so I kind of winged it a little. And they were like, oh, well, we have a permit, but we don't know where it's at. I said, no, I got to see it. You know, you can't have these. And so I said, can I use your phone? I said, I got to make a call. And I need to see ID, so they let me use their phone. So I had the number for the Fish and Wildlife agent in Boston. And I said, hey, I'm driving down the road. These people have 2 turkey vultures. They say they're rehab, but they don't have their permits. I said, here's their name, here's their drivers, their DL, and came back and goes, yeah, they haven't had a permit like 5 years. They had a really dirty facility, and they're not supposed to have them. I said, okay, I'll seize them and let animal control take them to a wildlife rehab center, you know, over near, I believe it was Burlingame State Park. There was a rehab center over that way. And he said, yeah, he goes, good job. Get all the information and, you know, get back with me. And so used their phone again because there was no else way to do it. I had no radio, so I called animal control. They came and I said, bring dog kennels, because turkey vultures are like eagles. They're huge. They're nasty. They were spitting stuff up at me like, I don't know, puke, vomit. Used big blankets to put around them so they wouldn't open their wings, and kind of put them in upright because they can't lean. And you know, that was kind of neat. Made a good case for the Fish and Wildlife agent. Got all the information, and they took it to the rehab center. And these 2 people would eventually be issued citations by the special agent up in Boston for, again, having these 2 turkey vultures without an MBTA permit. Later told the boss, and he was like, well, you didn't have permission to do that. Legally, you were okay. It worked out, and the agent's happy, so just don't do that again. You gotta stay on the refuge. You know, you're really supposed, especially being a season, you really shouldn't be doing the stuff off refuge. But, you know, that was cool, because I really excited about doing fish and wildlife stuff. Because, like I said, at Ninigret, so much of my work was perverts and dog off leash and, you know, stupid things. Anyway, 38 minutes. It's a long video, but people out there in fish and wildlife, I just ask, you know, listen to this, because don't ever let it go back to what it used to be. You know, where a refuge manager could say, no, you're not going to wear a gun because that might offend people. You know, pink slips, not being able to write our own tickets. We didn't even know. We had handcuffs, but we weren't even told arrest procedures. If I had to arrest someone, I didn't even know where to take them. I didn't understand the marshal service and court procedures for arrest. They were like, yeah, we don't want you making arrest. No, we don't do that here. How do you know? You get punched in the face, you got to arrest them, and then what? You got no radio, you don't know where to go. You have to turn them over to somebody local, maybe. But that's what we were up to. That's what we were up against back then. 1991, Rhode Island, Ninigret National Wildlife Refuge. You know, we were treated like a necessary evil, and also that our main job wasn't fish and game enforcement. We were to deal with, you know, the public coming out and doing stupid things or you know, perverted things. And it was interesting, but definitely I would tell people, if you want to be a refuge officer in some of these refuges, you need to talk to people that have worked there to find out. You know, you may not want to deal with perverts and naked people running around and dog off leashes and parking violations. Some of these refuges, that's what you do primarily. Anyway, thank you for taking the time to listen. It's a long video, but you know, it's an interesting part of the history of of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Refuge law enforcement program. And, I kept one of my patches. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, but I have my Refuge officer patch on my patch collection, and I take pride in that. So anyway, thanks for listening. Good night.